All right, so Senator Jon Ossoff from my home state here in Georgia is apparently going to be introducing some legislation to ban members of Congress from trading stocks, which is basically just a direct contradiction from what we heard recently from the Democratic leadership, specifically Nancy Pelosi. So just to give you guys a little bit of a reminder in terms of how we ended up here, and then I'll get into the actual legislation that he is proposing. But we had this story that came out just a couple weeks ago, back in early December, from Business Insider, that was pointing out that at least 182 high-ranking congressional staffers have violated a federal conflicts of interest law with overdue disclosure of their personal stock trades. And of course, it's not just, ranking congressional staffers, it's also the members of Congress themselves. This is nothing secret, this is nothing new, but again, 52 members of Congress have violated a law designed to stop insider trading. So this is not just like 52 members in total are doing insider trading. These are just the ones who have managed to violate the very bare minimum rules that are currently in place. So basically, this is referring to what's called the Stock Act, which is supposed to limit the ability for members of Congress to do insider trading. Basically, obviously, in my opinion, they shouldn't be even allowed to own stocks, because that in and of itself would make them geared more towards legislation that prioritizes the stock market over average working class Americans. But that's a different point. This is just like complete surface level corruption right here. Okay, it's just completely ridiculous. These are the people, more than anybody else in the country, who have a direct legislative control over what is going to happen to the stock market, and they are literally profiting off of it on the back end. I mean, you can get even more specific within industries themselves. I mean, I covered a story recently that a majority of the members on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the people who decide the legislation about how we are going to be conducting war and war financing, they have investments in a lot of these weapons manufacturers like Raytheon and Boeing. So it's like you see the direct corruption, you see the direct perverse incentives of allowing members of Congress to own any stocks at all, let alone do it in the most egregious ways possible that they have been doing. So Nancy Pelosi was asked about this incredibly corrupt dynamic, basically, and I showed you guys the clip. It was absolute ghoul shit. It was ridiculous, but she basically came out and defended the ability for her and her colleagues to do insider trading, citing the free market. I mean, seriously, the free market, when we are literally talking about the ability of politicians who have control over regulating this so-called free market to turn around and just say that, oh, well, it's just a free market. It's like, no, literally the problem that we are talking about at hand right now is you guys who have an influence over the so-called free market. So it's not a free market. The free market is a unicorn. It doesn't exist in any way, shape, or form, but that's what, a hyper-capitalist neoliberal ghoul like Nancy Pelosi would use as a justification to basically do blatant corruption. So this is what we heard from Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic establishment, and that basically gets us to where we are right now with Jon Ossoff seemingly introducing a pretty based piece of legislation, although, I don't want to give too much credit, because, again, we're talking about brazen corruption. We're not talking about, actually fulfilling some sort of a democratic promise and fighting for the will of the American people. We're literally just talking about, should politicians be able to engage in brazen corruption? And this doesn't even begin to tackle the entire depth of corruption within the U.S. political system. So it's just the bare minimum, but, still credit to Jon Ossoff, I guess. He's a new senator. He was just elected recently, and, credit to him for basically challenging the Democratic establishment, I guess, in the barest minimum way possible. But just to give you a little bit of context here before we get into the actual legislation itself, Jon Ossoff, again, from my home state here in Georgia, the guy who he actually replaced to win his Senate seat, the guy that he beat in that recent election back in 2020, was basically like the kingpin of insider trading, okay? His name was David Perdue, and you can see here, this was just a recent, from a couple years ago, a New York Times article from December of 2020, pointing out that he did 2,600 trades in one term inside Senator Perdue's stock portfolio. The Georgia Republican stock trades have far outpaced those of his Senate colleagues and have included a range of companies within his Senate committee's oversight. So again, it's just brazen corruption. He is trading in stocks, and this guy specifically, more than anybody else in the Senate. So, again, this is the kingpin of insider trading, or was at least, after, Jon Ossoff succeeded in beating him. But, literally, he is trading in stocks that he is also regulating within his committee positions in the Senate. So it's just, again, completely ridiculous at surface level brazen corruption, but that's what Jon Ossoff is trying to rein in here, and you can see with the context of who he beat, why he might want to draw some sort of a dichotomous comparison within himself. So let's just go ahead and get into some of the details in terms of what the actual legislation is. So they say here from the New York post, Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff is looking to introduce a bill that would ban members of Congress from trading individual stocks, a practice that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has defended as her husband rakes in millions of dollars trading shares of tech companies, the Post has learned. And the Ossoff ethics bill, which the Democratic freshman senator plans to introduce once he finds a Republican co-sponsor, that part's a little bit weird, would crack down on conflicts of interest by making it illegal for lawmakers and their families to trade stocks while in office. And their families part is obviously a very key part in all of this, because as they were just pointing out, it's not even necessarily that Nancy Pelosi herself is doing a lot of the corruption. It's that her husband is making millions and millions of dollars trading on, whether it's like the regulation of big tech. There was that recent story that came out where her husband basically made a bunch of money off of betting on Google stock after he knew that some of the legislation that was put forward that was going to tackle the monopoly power of Google, he knew basically because of his connection to Nancy Pelosi that it didn't have a good chance of passing. And so it's like that's the type of corruption that also needs to be taken on in correspondence with the direct corruption from the members of Congress themselves, because the families part is also obviously a pretty big role in this. So it's good that he includes that in this legislation. But they continue here saying that it would also likely require lawmakers to put their assets in a blind trust, a step that the 34-year-old Jon Ossoff completed himself months after being elected in January 2021, another good part of this. And they say that obviously no Senate Republicans appear to have publicly come out against congressional stock trades, so Ossoff may have trouble finding a co-sponsor in the Senate, but Republican support in the House is more likely, since several GOP lawmakers, including Texas Representatives Michael Cloud and Chip Roy, who I also believe is from Georgia, have come out against the practice. So again, that part of it is kind of weird to me and almost makes me question whether or not he's serious about this, because you're not going to get a Senate Republican to co-sponsor this piece of legislation for you. The Senate Republicans, and as much as I, critique Nancy Pelosi for her corruption, obviously, and the other members of the Democratic establishment, you can multiply that times 10 with the entirety of the Republican Party. I mean, the entire Republican Party in the Senate is also doing this same type of insider trading as Nancy Pelosi is. So it's like, you're not going to get members of Congress who are profiting to the tunes of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from their stock portfolio. They have a direct financial incentive to not rein this in, to not further regulate this, right? So it's going to be extremely difficult to get anybody on board with this, let alone, especially members of the Democratic establishment, let alone Republicans. So to me, saying that you're waiting for a co-sponsor from the Republican Party is kind of a red flag in a lot of ways. He should just be aggressively coming out and making the public arguments for this right now anyways, without waiting on literally anybody, and try to do a public pressure campaign to force people to fall in line. Because again, this is something that the vast majority of the American people are on board with. This is just from January 7th of this year, to give you a very updated perspective on it. 76% of voters disagreed with Pelosi and think that members of Congress have an unfair advantage in trading stocks. So look, the American people, they see the corruption in this. Again, it's not that difficult. You don't have to do any crazy deep digging or anything like that. It's happening right in front of our eyes. So obviously, if 80% or so of the American people are siding with Jon Ossoff in this, then he should use that tool, right? You shouldn't be waiting for some corrupt Senate Republican to come and join the party with you. You should be going out there, making the public arguments, and realize the fact that you have 80%, including, a majority of Republicans, a majority of independents, and a vast majority of Democrats. You already have people on your side. And this is something that, Democrats and Republicans, well, Republicans do it a little bit more, but in a very perverse way. But Democrats absolutely refuse to try to rile up their own base, right? Jon Ossoff, if he goes out there and he's on the major networks and he's rallying the American people and he's pointing out the corruption of members within his own party, people are going to fuck with that. People are going to love that, okay? I personally would love that. So that's what he should be doing, realizing that he has the vast majority of the American people already on his side, okay? Believe it or not, we're supposed to have a representative democracy, and so if 80% of people believe and support something, then it should probably get enacted. So you just have to go out there and point out those very basic facts. I mean, again, it's very brazen at surface level corruption. You have members of Congress who are profiting thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from their stock portfolios that they are directly compromised because they get insider information that the rest of the country doesn't have access to. And they're basically just doing criminal insider trading, which they are never held accountable for. And a part of that also is with the relaxed rules that are within the Stock Act, which is the current legislation that is supposed to be reining a lot of this insider trading in. The reality is that the punishments, if you get caught for doing insider trading, or if you violate the rules of the reporting system that they have in place, I mean, it just doesn't matter at that point, because they only have to pay like $200 as a fine, even potentially. Most of them don't even have to pay fines at all. But even if you get caught doing this, the fine for violating the Stock Act is like $200. Well, well, what the fuck is $200 when I just made, tens of thousands of dollars doing insider trading? It's just like, it's laughably ridiculous. And obviously the members of Congress who are deciding legislation are probably not going to be all that inclined to further regulate or punish themselves when they are the criminals. I mean, it's like literally letting the criminals decide their own court case, okay? It's completely ridiculous. You're not going to get anything out of it. So if Jon Ossoff is serious, which, again, credit to him for doing this in the first place and being willing to directly, publicly challenge Nancy Pelosi in this way, credit to you for doing that. But again, we're talking about the very bare minimum. This barely would scratch the surface of corruption that exists within the DC swamp. And so, you might as well go full blast. You might as well use this as an opportunity. And, if you're able to successfully pull it off, then Jon Ossoff would absolutely catapult himself up the ranks of popularity within the United States. So it's something he absolutely should do. And again, this is the very bare minimum.